So if Games Workshop stick to their normal release schedule, then for every Warhammer 40k codex that comes out, there should be a corresponding miniature release. Let's talk through all the codexes to come in 10th edition, what the factions should get, and perhaps what they're most likely to. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking codexes and model releases, what sort of cool stuff people might like to see from Games Workshop's future releases in 10th, and any hints and things that we might have already had. So far in 10th edition, around about a year after launch, we've had 11 out of the 26 codexes in Warhammer 40k come out. For the most part, Games Workshop seems to have tailored these to some of the more popular and well-played factions in a game, starting off with Space Marines and Tyranids, then Admech and Necrons, Custodius Dark Angels, Tau Orcs and Chaos following in spring, and then recently the Sisters and Genestealer cult. So far, every single one of those has come with at least one miniature, and by the way that Games Workshop normally tend to do things, it's usually just one or two characters, or actually going for a big faction release wave that seems to come out in a launch Battle Force box these days. The launch factions of the edition always get one, so Space Marines and Tyranids got one, and then since then we've had Dark Angels and Tau Empire with their new Kroot range. Otherwise the rest of them, mostly they just got one token character to add to the ranks there. The Custodians got their Shield Captain, and the Admech got their Stilt Sniper. Though occasionally a few factions have got more than one character release, such as Necrons and Chaos. That seems to be the general pattern of more normal Warhammer 40k releases, with things like Kill Team sprinkled in on top, but it does mean it's kind of intriguing thinking about what's going to come for the rest of 10th edition. Another 15-ish odd codex books, depending on if any are consolidated or we get any new ones like Emperor's Children. And for this one I just wanted to revisit a few possibilities as to things that they could do with their factions when we get round to them. Let's go through each army in turn, talk about what they might want and what they might most likely to be receiving, and if Games Workshop had given us any hints or clues, to take a look at that at the same time. Jumping right in, we have the Grey Knights. The Knights of Titan could go one of two ways. I feel like they're certainly an army where it's either going to be a total range refresh or just something like a single character update. And my guess is that maybe similar to the Black Templars, there might not be all that much in between. For character updates, I do feel like there's a few really obvious ones. Caldor Drago himself in a resin fine cast miniature, and Brother Captain Stern seems like a very obvious miniature to transition into a fancy plastic kit. Though maybe for other possibilities beyond that, perhaps a generic Grandmaster or Brother Captain in plastic could be kind of nice. That must be at least kind of high on the priority list for a more standard HQ. Games Workshop do feel like they've been going through and filling in a few gaps like that, with things like a standard more multi-part Chaos Lord, or Custodian Shield Captain outside of the infantry box sets that they can build. Otherwise I'd be kind of surprised if we got anything too weird and different in terms of miniatures until they'd redone the core range once more. Terminators have a new scaling, so it seems very likely that they'll have them upscaled at some point with a Terminator and Paladin kit. And similar for their rank and file type Space Marines with things like their Strike Marines, I'd guess that they'd probably acquire the Primaris scaling, but maybe not the actual Primaris styling, and stick as Firstborn as Castel and Crowdis. I wouldn't be too surprised if they redid the Dread Knight though I feel like maybe that's slightly lower down the priority list. That one's definitely always been a miniature that divided opinion since it came out. I feel like there might be a few players out there who might not be against them having another go and redoing the styling a bit. There don't seem to have been any big rumours about a Grey Knight release coming up, so maybe we'll just get a character release this edition, though we'll wait and see. Next up, and sticking with inquisitorial things, we've got the Imperial Agents. They've had their own index cards at the start of the edition, and most people are expecting them to get a book all of their own, particularly as we saw a bunch of pages leaked from a printing warehouse somewhere. A lot of people are predicting that Mystery Codex to wind up being Imperial Agents, collating rules like the Assassins, Inquisitors, and Voidsmen at Arms and things. For miniatures for them, they do feel like there's a few obvious choices. Inquisitor Kotias had a teaser segment at the end of Arcs of Omen, which was a book series that was very heavily tied to miniature releases, and I feel like he's kind of odds on to get a plastic release at some point in 10th edition. Otherwise there's Inquisitor Karamazov as well, and maybe you could redo a generic Inquisitor, or even just re-release that Erasmus Cartavolnus miniature that they had. Feels like he'd do quite well as just a more standard Inquisitor. I was kind of ashamed that he was a limited edition one where he briefly came out and then went away. Otherwise could do things like Inquisitorial Stormtroopers, or maybe do a unit of Crusaders, which have often been in different Imperial armies like Guard or Sisters. Would be nice to have a full unit of them with their swords and shields, and either of those feel like they could be kind of fun for a Kill Team release if they fancied it. Otherwise, there was also this preacher spotted in the rumour engine, carrying the sort of ironbound skull in a box that's similar to an old Inquisitor scale miniature. Not sure if that's anything to do with Imperial agents, or whether or not it could be a guard preacher, or maybe something from Necromunda perhaps. I guess we'll wait and see on that front. Next up, we've got the Thousand Sons, who haven't had any sort of major release in absolutely ages since their range was first established. The only actual miniature that was added to it, outside of more generic Chaos Space Marine things, is the Infernal Master model, and even he was essentially just a different sort of flavour and fun sorcerer sculpt. I'd argue that the rest of their range has held up pretty well, though I think their unit choice just needs expanding a bit, maybe a few more actual Thousand Sons to fight on the battle line beyond just Scarab Occult Terminators and Rubric Marines. Currently, they feel like the only two core squads outside of sorcerers and characters carrying the spirit of the army. For things on the Thousand Sons wish list, I've often seen things like melee rubrics of some sort. I can't help but think that something like a combination of spears and shields would look rather awesome. You could maybe have some heavy weapon or havoc style rubrics, perhaps with Soul Reaper cannons, maybe a unique psychic dreadnought. Though I guess at least whenever their book does come out, they'll likely have their combat patrol reimagined, and that could definitely be a positive for them with a few fewer Zangors and more Rubric Marines in it. Given recent lore and a couple of rumour engine pictures though, people are strongly suspecting that they're going to get some sort of demon engine automata type thing. There were really quite clear allusions to them in current Warhammer 40k lore teased in a white dwarf operating within the Pariah Nexus with the assistance of those. And there's really some possibility that the rumour engine pictures here could be that miniature. They're definitely not confirmed, and it could be something else for Necromunda or something completely different. It does sound like that they're odds on for those automata though, and if so, that kind of implies that they might get a few units and an actual release wave type thing rather than just a single character, so it might be a good addition for the Thousand Sons if they're lucky. Next up, we have the Astra Militarum, which are the most collected and followed army that hasn't had a Codex release yet. In general, there's been a lot of speculation that Guard are going to be getting another fairly major release wave to follow their last one for a few different reasons. It could be one reason why their Codex is coming later on again, given that they've had a release wave of models in the not too distant past, so Games Workshop likely wants to space them out about as much as possible as editions would allow. There have been some guard rumour engines, such as this Minefield one and this Banner one, which look really quite specific, and there have been a few more that look potentially guard beyond that. And Games Workshop do seem to have a bit of a trend of if you get one major release in the last edition, then you might well follow up with a second one in the next one, often going 2 editions at a time in terms of big releases. Some things like Chaos and Orcs have followed that trend. For options for guard units to release, there's a ridiculous amount of choice that they could do. Kastan Jungle Fighters have been crying out for an update that's at least similar to their command squad for a long time now. They do feel like perhaps some of the more embarrassing models that Games Workshop's still selling, after it's been kind of clear that they needed updates for a good decade or more. The Ratlings would be nice to have in plastic. Commissar Yarrick is rumoured dead, but I feel like there wouldn't be any resistance at all if he turned up again, ready to take the fight to the Orcs once more. Death Riders of Krieg seem possible to come over to plastic at some point, given how popular they are in Forge World. Plus, Games Workshop seems to have been removing just about anything Forge World that isn't a super heavy from 40k, so literally anything else that's a Forge World unit for the Guard would be handy to have ported over, though I feel like realistically not much is going to. There's plenty of Lost Regiments that could be fun as a Kill Team style kit similar to the Kriegsmen. Valhallans or Vostrons would be really nice to see, even if they were upgrade sprue type affairs. They could do big artillery carriages similar to Forge World, maybe upscale versions of the field ordnance guns. You could bring back the Taurus Venator, which they've done for Necromunda. The Guard would definitely welcome that back. Elysians could come out as a release. They do seem happy to do single kits for regiments like the Attilan Rough Riders, and they feel like they could be equivalent. Or maybe get some Aeronautica Imperialis on the go, maybe things like a Lightning or Thunderbolt fighter. They need a pretty massive list of updates, to be honest. But if they had a mind to, they could also go new. Guard Bikers of some point seem like it's almost a surprise that they haven't had a unit like that at some point. Or maybe jump packs of some kind if they're feeling fancy. And he could bring back things like special weapon squads, conscripts, or veterans as well. Any of those could theoretically have their own kit if they wanted. I'm sure plenty of people would welcome them returning to the roster. Loads of options for Guard in any case. Hopefully they get a fair few bits of that list ticked off whenever the release comes out. They seem odds on to get a few kits come out. I'll be interested to find out what this banner and minefield marker wind up being though. I kind of wonder if the minefield and the sandbags and things might either be part of a particular big character's scenic base, or possibly something like an emplacement for an artillery carriage perhaps. For the Knights, both Imperial and Chaos, seems at least kind of likely that they might do a dual release of the codexes at the same time as they did in the last edition. One of the recent release trends for them has been getting the Forge World versions of the Knights released in plastic but with an aim at Horus Heresy. We've had 3 of the Sevastus class chassis coming out, and certainly seems very likely that they'd go for the other Forge World variants after that. They've still got the Sevastus Atropos, and then also the Questor Styrex and Bagheera, the Armiger Moirax. I kind of wonder if they'd ever go as far as making a plastic Acastus or Porphyrion. I'm not sure if that might be getting out of the scope of regular Games Workshop plastics though. Seems like there's some chance they'd leave that resin. I feel like it would be really nice if Games Workshop just included the datasheets for the Forge World Knights in the core codex and just gave us some safety that they'd be part of the range going forward. They do seem to like to keep their game modes as separate as possible. I just really hope they don't do what they did to the Space Marine and Chaos things that were Horus Heresy predominant and just lock them out to that setting besides Legends. Otherwise, besides the Forge World Knight releases, maybe for 40k expanding the Armiger kit to mirror the Chaos kit, or at least maybe mirror it in principle, even if it's not exactly the same, would be kind of fun. Perhaps having parts for a dedicated melee variant, or perhaps a Gatling gun arm could be kind of nice. Perhaps another option could be something like a Psychic Knight chassis, maybe a bit of a Paragon Wizard sort of role as opposed to the Fell Magic and Warp Storms of the Abominant. For the Chaos Knights, perhaps a unique version of the Dominus or Tyrant, actually with Chaos symbols and iconography would be kind of nice. Or I guess they could farm out another Abhorrent kit, perhaps give yet another upgrade frame into the same one that makes the Abominant, the Rampager and the Desecrator. If they did so, then that would mirror the Imperial variants, where they basically had their Questoris kit 2 different times. The first one with the Warden and Gallant type things, and then the Preceptor and Canis Rex. Otherwise, entirely possible that at some point they could come out with an entirely new class of knights. Maybe something between the Armiger and the Questoris weight seems like it could be a gap they could go for. Or something else weird and uninspected in a different sort of theme of combat, maybe a heavily shielded and armoured siege knight perhaps, or something with some big jet engines like a jump armiger or something. Just completely wild speculation on my part there. I do wonder if they might ever go the route of adding sort of vassal infantrymen at some point. I guess part of the attraction to them is that you're collecting an entire army of big stompy walkers. I feel like some feudal night world serfs would be kind of awesome to see in 40k styling though. Whether they're more chivalric and Imperial led, or some kind of twisted dark mech cultist on the Chaos side. Both Imperials and Chaos do tend to wind up using loads of allies in competitive play. It seems like it'd be a kind of fun thing if they had some more on-brand people to do grunt work like hold objectives. Lots of possibilities. I'd hope that the Imperial Knights might get at least some sort of release this time round, given that they were one of the only factions that didn't really get anything in 9th edition, at least when their codex released anyway. They have been getting the Cerastus ones as mentioned. For some Space Marines, the Deathwatch may be on some slightly shaky ground at the moment. People have been rumouring that they might be folded into Agents of the Imperium or otherwise reinterpreted. Certainly wouldn't be great news for them if they in any way lose full faction support for people who've collected their armies. That feels like they might be in the slight danger zone like Harlequins were before. They are one of 40k's least played armies. That's all just speculation at this point, but I can see why people are being concerned given that they basically had 0 full-scale Primaris model releases, and Games Workshop seem to have been intentionally neglectful of the Primaris kill teams that they've got, passing them over twice in a row for 2 different balance updates, maybe implying that they're not trying to emphasise them at the moment. Potential fearmongering aside though, I feel like a Primaris veteran kill team of some sort would be pretty awesome for the Deathwatch. You could actually have a kit that represents the kind of pleasing mix of different armor marks and things that can fight side by side. Would be kind of fun to have a dedicated kit for that, adding a lot more theme than the Primaris Space Marines get currently in terms of Deathwatch miniatures. Otherwise, I guess if you're going individual character releases, maybe the obvious choice is the Watchmaster, though he is a kind of recent miniature. Next up, for the Sons of Mortarion, we have the Death Guard. They're doing a bit better than their other rival deity legions, such as Thousand Sons and World Eaters right now. They did get quite a lot of kits and love in 8th edition when they were the primary antagonist faction to the new Primaris. If they just get a standard character release, then perhaps something like a standard Death Guard Lord on foot of some sort might be a reasonable addition to the range. They're pretty well saturated for all manner of cheap support characters, but it does seem odd that they don't have one and just have to go for the standard Chaos Lord kits for that, so it feels like that one could be a fairly easy win for a release that makes sense. Otherwise, I feel like the best bet for units they might want could be to look at the other deity legions, having some unique possessed like the World Eaters, So maybe a Nurgle equivalent of 8-bound perhaps could be fun. You could do something similar to those rather creepy Galapox infected miniatures that people tend to like quite a lot. Like the Thousand Sons, it'd be kind of nice to see Plague Marines have other roles in the Codex other than just rank and file troops. You could definitely do Havocs or maybe some sort of Rapture equivalent, born aloft on some massive jump packs perhaps. I feel like a unique Hellbrute or Dreadnought would be rather awesome, though they don't seem to have gone that way too much for Chaos recently. And otherwise I feel like there'd be a lot of support for them releasing the original Lord of Contagion individually, the one that came out in Dark Imperium. The Lord Felthius one is a bit of a curious miniature release. He does look a little bit on the cartoony side. Otherwise, maybe on the wish list might be reboxing Plague Marines to actually have a set of 10 of them. They did have that Plague Marine reinforcements thing that could be quite nice to have included in the same box. And like the Thousand Sons, I strongly suspect that they're an army that'll be looking forward to getting their hands on their combat patrol. It'd be very nice to see a few less Plague Bearers, and maybe either some Terminators, or perhaps a light Demon engine like a Blight Hauler perhaps, and maybe not quite such a zombie horde as the Start Collecting box. I would be kind of surprised if they get any enormous release though, given that they're doing a fair bit better than the Thousand Sons and World Eaters for unique kits right now. Talking of the World Eaters, they seem near enough guarantees to be getting a fairly major release in 10th edition. It kind of clearly looks like they got around about half their range towards the end of 9th edition in a release that felt a little bit unusual and rushed. The 9th edition Codex almost felt like a bit of a reverse engineering of 10th edition rules. It'll be really nice to see what else they get, and I'm sure that we'll get at least a fair few kits for them this time around. One of the things that basically everyone was expecting but turned out not to turn up were the Red Butcher Terminators. Maybe they might be by a different name in 40k, but given how we've got one style of Terminators for Thousand Sons and two different ones for Death Guard, feels like World Eaters should have some of their own. I still say that odds on this time round. Berserker Juggernaut Cavalry seems like it's probably going to be a thing. It looked like there were some teased in art, and it might make sense to have them to go alongside Lord Invocatus and the Lord on Juggernauts. A Berserker Surgeon seems to be near enough confirmed, given that it was just crazily heavily teased in lore last time round. Lots of references for them creating the 8-bound and maintaining the butcher's nails. I just can't imagine that they'd have them so front and central if there wasn't going to be a miniature for them. Again, like the Death Guard, it's really weird for them not to have an actual standard Lord on foot. They can't even field the standard Chaos Space Marine one, unlike the Death Guard. So Chaos Lords in power armor, or maybe Terminator armor for the World Eaters would be nice. I think something I'd really like to see as well would be some sort of Cornate Demon engine. Maybe taking some notes from the Khorne Blood Slaughterer from the Forge World range. I think a light demon engine of Khorne would be really quite fun to have charge up and do some heavy lifting. Whatever their release is though, I feel like it's kind of likely they're going to be running up to you really quite quickly and hitting you hard with a chain axe. As the other army that came out in 9th edition and felt like they didn't really get their entire range, the Leagues of Votann again are heavily rumoured to be getting a good release wave this time round too. I felt like the amount of kits that they got was at least fairly good in 9th edition, a bit more impressive in number than the World Eaters anyway, even if they did get their Primarch. And since then we have had one expansion to the army in the Hernkin Jaegers, quite nicely filling the infiltrate role with their Kill Team release. Given that the Leagues are a fairly truly new faction in Warhammer 40k, taking lots of notes from the squats but then heavily reinterpreting them, I do feel like they've got fairly free reign as to where they go from them from here. I think some sort of walker unit feels like it to be well within their sort of scope and theming. Some kin crewed mech suits would be pretty nice. I feel like they could certainly be an army where they maybe have a big robot of some sort, maybe the equivalent of the Admech Castellan robots. Certainly seems on theme with their ancestor cores guiding their society. Otherwise feels like we've probably seen a teaser of their jump packs, given that we've got one in the Hearthkin Salvagers kill team that we had. I'd be kind of surprised if we don't get a unit of jump packs like this, given how they've designed them and everything. Looks like Plasma Axe and Bolt Pistol could be the way that they're armed, unless they decide to re-kit them for the actual jump pack release. Otherwise, in the Codex there were a few pictures of something that looks like a Leagues of Votann flyer or speeder type thing. You can see one up here with the dual wings and the 3 engines. Just looking at that, it looks like it could perhaps be something somewhat equivalent to perhaps a League of Votann equivalent of the Space Marine Storm Speeders. That could be kind of nice. In any case, I feel like there's probably going to be a fair few things that they surprise us with the next Votann release. Seems like there's lots of directions that they could go. I have a feeling that probably Land Train isn't going to be one of them. I feel like the closest that we're getting to that is the Hecaton Land Fortress. Next up, for the Sons of Sanguinius, we have the Blood Angels. They've been rumoured to have at least a somewhat big release this edition. It does feel like the setup for them has been maybe kind of similar to the Dark Angels. We've had generic Terminators released at the start of the edition, and then they got their unique version in the Deathwing Knights. It feels like by having generic Jump Infantry released at the start of the edition in the Jump Intercessors, there's now a bit more room for the Blood Angels creating fancy versions of them with their Sanguinary Guard or Death Company. There's also a rather interesting set of flowing parchments that were in a rumour engine that look really quite similar to the Sanguinors ones. Definitely isn't enough to confirm that, but certainly seems possible given that we haven't seen any for the Stormcast yet, and it didn't turn out to be the Sisters Jump Canoness. It doesn't look like the other Sisters miniature with the Cherub Sensor Bearers. If they follow the pattern of the Dark Angels, then it might be that Games Workshop gives them some of their new kits this edition, and then seemingly keep some of them in reserve till the next one. The Dark Angels seemingly got their Deathwing update this edition with the Deathwing Knights and Belial, plus a couple of more generic releases in Asmodai and some Inner Circle companions, though there's still clearly more to do for the Dark Angels as the Raven Wing weren't touched. I'd guess that they'll be next time. If Games Workshop did do something similar with the Blood Angels, it might mean that we get some but not all of their miniatures this edition, and then some of the rest are saved until 11th perhaps. Certainly high on the wish list though would be Sanguinary Guard and Death Company, both of which seem pretty guaranteed to get new releases. The Sanguinary Guard would be pretty awesome to have at Primaris scale, and the Death Company would be nice not just to be equipped with Intercessor chainsaws, but get some fancy power fists and power weapons and things. Then they've got a whole cast of characters that they could do with refreshes for. The Martyrs, Astarath, the Sanguinor, Brother Corbulo, and maybe a generic Sanguinary Priest as well. I'd guess Tycho wouldn't be getting an update given that he's lore dead for a long time now, though I wouldn't be quite as optimistic with their unique dreadnoughts or vehicles making the jump. The Baal Predator and the Furioso Dreadnought sort of feel like they already have kind of Primaris equivalents in the Gladiator Reaper and the Brutalis Dreadnought. Maybe we might see an upgrade sprue that give them a little bit of Blood Angels flavour. Black Templars and Dark Angels both got at least fairly meaty upgrade sprues to go alongside their launch. Overall though, certainly interested to see what Blood Angels could come out with in 10th. I'd certainly be interested in some new Sanguinary Guard myself. Next up, we've got the Codex that isn't released yet in the Emperor's Children. Games Workshop certainly hasn't officially announced this yet, but they basically soft confirmed it given that they removed Emperor's Children from the core Chaos Space Marine Codex in exactly the same way as they did so with World Eaters back in 9th edition, and due to that, it just seems like they could follow a very similar sort of path. If they're going to do a big end of edition campaign like Arcs of Omen, seems kind of likely that Fulgrim could feature in that in some way. And if that turns out to be the case, then maybe it might drop at a similar sort of timing as World Eaters did in 9th edition. For Emperor's Children, some things seem absolutely guaranteed, though some are maybe a little bit more speculative. If they were releasing them as their own thing, then new Noise Marines, Lucius the Eternal, and Fulgrim himself all seem pretty much absolute certain. It'd be really quite nice to have the last of the Cult Space Marines finally released for the actual modern era. Though interesting to see exactly what they do differently to Fulgrim's transfigured sculpt in the Horus Heresy. Seems likely that he'd be at least somewhat similar to that though. Otherwise though, like Thousand Sons and the Death Guard, some new Terminators seem like they'll probably be on the cards. Hopefully like World Eaters too if they do get some in 10th. Some sort of raised Slaneshi cultists seem like they'd be near guaranteed as well, given that all the other legions got them as well. Some sort of themed horde unit to go alongside the actual Chaos Marines. They could go a long way into various different support characters like the Death Guard got, and otherwise things like demon engines, possessed alternatives, or maybe a unique Sonic Dreadnought or Hellbrute, all could be possible. Lots of different ways in which they could expand the army. I suspect if they did come out like this though, then it would probably be a smallish launch range, similar to what the World Eaters got, maybe a little bit more generous, probably establishing the core of the army, and then a bunch of follow-up releases to come next edition. Sticking with the Chaos and for the forces of the Demons, there's a few more obvious things that they're missing from their roster, several units that went out of production due to being fine cast resin miniatures, Epidemius, the Blue Scribes, the Transweaver, Herald on Juggernaut and Floxmaster. Judging by Games Workshop's normal trends in the 10th edition codexes, there's at least a reasonable chance that if they don't get releases at this point, they could be cut from the codex, though as with the Necrons, they might choose to rescue some of them, like they did with Orican the Diviner and Imhotep the Stormlord. Otherwise, for ranged things, the Spoilpox Scrivener There's a Nurgle Herald variant that they can field, but is weirdly only available in Vanguard Maggotkin for Age of Sigmar. Maybe a little bit odd that they have him in the roster, but also not very easy to get. Furies of Chaos are one that went away that could make a return at some point. I feel like the Warcry Chaos Beasts could have been quite a good option if they even just repurposed those exact same models for release in 40k. I don't think anyone would complain too much. Otherwise, if you wanted to adapt Demons to a more 40k setting, then anything with more machinery and perhaps more soul grinder variants could be an option, or the demon engines of that same sort of class. Feels like Vastor might well get a Dark Mechanicum faction of his own at some point. Does seem like he's been standing apart from Codex Chaos Demons being fielded alongside the Heretic Astartes Space Marines. Otherwise, just for remakes though, I feel like most of the lesser demons have to be at least fairly high on the priority list. A lot of the rest of the Codex has been gradually resculpted over the years, one by one. The lesser demons are some of the older miniatures now, maybe things like Bloodletters and Demonettes wouldn't be the worst to redo. Blood Crushers are also a little bit on the dated side, though I still think they're fun models. For the Drukhari, their needs are kind of obvious compared with some, I think. There's not many armies in Warhammer 40k where a good section of their entire army range has basically gone out of production because it was in fine cast resin and presumably it wasn't selling very well. Urian Rakarth, the Cult of the Archon, Grotesques, and the Beastmaster and Beast packs are all out of production. Several of those were kind of terrible kits in terms of value to represent the units in game though. The Grotesque that they had was just an individual monopose one, which was really weird when you needed units of more than one to field them. And if you wanted to buy a beast pack just actually from the models that they were selling, then that would cost you a ridiculous amount, and the models I'd say were merely okay. I feel like all of that coming back in plastic is perhaps one of the most pressing things for them. So if they did decide to give the Drukhari an actual major release, then it'd be really nice to see the return of Astra Vect. He seems like the exact sort of faction commander that Games Workshop likes to release these days, with things like returning Primarchs and the Necron Silent King coming back. He's one of the genuine big bad narrative forces in Warhammer 40k, and I guess he'd likely be mounted on his Days of Destruction. Definitely other options for characters that could reappear though, maybe Lady Malice or Duke Slisus. They could come back for miniatures that never had an individual model release, and perhaps compared with some factions I feel like on the wish list might be asking Games Workshop to leave their very good Combat Patrol well alone. Though given the trend of 10th edition, I feel like that's probably unlikely. Hopefully they do get a model release this edition, as they're perhaps the most deserving out of any of the armies to do so. For the Space Wolves, the Sons of Russ are in a similar sort of place to the Blood Angels, waiting on a full range refresh at some point with Primaris scaling, updating the aging line of Space Viking models to the modern era. I guess with how Games Workshop would start about that would probably be some upgraded Wolfguard or Wolfguard Terminators as an early offering. I don't know whether they'd do similar for things like Blood Claws or Grey Hunters, or just use Primaris sculpts with upgrade sprues to represent them as per the lore. Otherwise, they've got lots and lots of characters: Arjat Rockfist, Logan Grimnar, Njal Stormcaller, Ulrich the Slayer, Lucas the Trickster, and more, plus any of the generic Primaris Wolf Lords and Vassal leaders, including the ones mounted on Thunderwolves. Again, there'd be odds on to get an upgrade sprue and reinterpreted combat patrol similar to things like Black Templars and Dark Angels. And perhaps some of the kits that have people with the most focus on at the moment are things like the Wolfen and Thunderwolves. I feel like both of those might be a little bit less desperate than some for updates for scale alone. Can't help but think that maybe the Wolfen are miniatures that might do well from a reinterpretation. Again, they're miniatures that do divide opinion a bit in terms of their looks. No idea as to their likelihood though. Feels like we haven't really had any big hints of Space Wolves getting any major attention sometime soon. If both Dark Angels and Blood Angels do wind up doing so, then it seems like they would be next in line though. Next up, we've got the Aeldari, and again, one of the factions that still needs a big release wave to try and update a whole bunch of their ailing model kits. Again, they're one of the armies that's suspected that might well get a few more miniatures in 10th edition compared with some. They did have a big model release last time round, but there's still clearly really quite a lot to do for the Space Elves. And again, going the slight theory of Games Workshop following up a release for an army with a second one the edition after, and then giving a break, it at least might imply some Aeldari coming for 10th. In 10th edition already, they have got Striking Scorpions via a Kill Team release, which was quite nice to tick off another one of the many aspects that needed updating. I guess Kill Team could also be possible for other ones of the aspects in the future though. In any case, for things on the Aeldari checklist, there's Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders, and Fire Dragons out of the Aspect Warriors. quite a lot of their Phoenix Lords, and Asaman has been heavily rumoured. I've seen a picture of a model that was reportedly Asaman for 10th edition, which did look quite convincing, though I guess we'll have to wait and see on that front. Otherwise, literally anything resin might have a Judgment Day in 10th edition. There's only been a few characters so far that have survived despite not having a plastic kit, a few Space Marines and a few things from other codexes like Trazen the Infinite, but could potentially be bad news for characters like Iriel and Illic Nightspear if Games Workshop don't make them plastic. The same is true for the Aeldari Forge World range as well. Things like Hornets and Shadow Spectres could potentially be on the way out. So far there haven't been any Forge World units that aren't super heavies that have survived for the codexes that have got releases so far, besides Custodians and Knights, which they said they were treating differently. I wouldn't have massive amounts of hope of too many of the Forge World kits being ported to plastic though. Otherwise, even beyond some of the obvious stuff, there's still some kits that are really quite old in the range. The Viper and Falcon are both fairly ancient miniatures as 40k plastic releases go. And beyond that, I guess there's quite a lot of possibilities for new Aeldari units, maybe the return of the Bonesinger from Dawn of War, who had a miniature in the past. Corsairs could be expanded if they had a mind to, maybe taking some inspiration from the Forge World range. They could do jet bikes for them. Exodite Aeldari would be kind of cool to see, maybe some tribal miniatures enlisting some great beasts from their home planets. It still feels like there could be a nice super heavy grav tank for them perhaps, though most armies don't have multiple different Titanic units to choose from, so maybe that's a little bit less likely given how much other things there are to do. Lots and lots of options though, hopefully Games Workshop show them a bit more love in 10th edition. Finally, for the 10th edition codexes, we have the Black Templars. They feel like one of the armies that's about as complete as any army in 40k is likely to get at this point, I guess. It wasn't like they really had an enormous amount of unique units from the past, but Games Workshop basically did the vast majority of them in 9th, saw Brethren Crusader squads and their 3 most famous characters, plus some generic heroes as well in their Marshals and Castellans. I'm honestly not sure what Games Workshop might come out with them for 10th edition, if anything. Maybe if I had to speculate, then perhaps something like a Black Templars specific chaplain kit with a little bit more righteous zeal theme could be a fun one for them. They are particularly known for their chaplains, so it might fit in nicely alongside the Castellan and Marshal, though maybe if we were to dream bigger, then perhaps some themed Terminators I think could be incredibly cool for the Black Templars, and that'd be kind of breaking new ground for 40k. It would be really cool to see a bit more for them, but maybe compared with armies like Dark Angels, it did feel like all the obvious choices all got done at once, so it feels a bit more like Games Workshop did a targeted full refresh of the range and might not give them as much attention for a while now. In any case though, I think I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your greatest wishlist items for your army in 40k, and what do you think Games Workshop is most likely to give them? Do you think that they'll get any sort of big model release this edition, or will it be just something like a token character? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages as well, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.